Hi, I'm Dr. Antonio Graceffo, and welcome to China Economic Research. Today's episode, U.S. supply chain vulnerabilities to China. The coronavirus pandemic has caused many to wonder just how vulnerable is the U.S. to China, both economically and in terms of shortages. U.S. technology companies are dependent on China for up to 50% of their parts and equipment. The auto industry depends on China for about 15% of its parts. In January and February, when Chinese factories closed down, these components were no longer exported, and work in other countries, particularly in the US, had to slow down or even stop because of lack of Chinese-made components and inputs. General Electric, Caterpillar, and the big three automakers, along with many smaller American businesses, depend on what is made in Chinese factories. In some ironic cases, even U.S. companies that left China before the coronavirus slowdown and relocated their manufacturing to other countries were still affected because China was still part of their supply chain and they lacked inputs from China. The Chinese domestic market is one of the largest markets for American movies and for cars. Apple, for example, sold $44 billion worth of products in China to Chinese consumers last year, and all of their stores were closed during the coronavirus quarantine. Factories in China were planning to get back online by February 10, but that did not happen because of the continued increase in infections and deaths, which kept factories closed until mid-March. As China claims to be ready to get back to work, orders from the U.S. and elsewhere have slowed because of shutdowns in other countries. In short, because U.S. supply chains run through China, economic slowdown in both countries is equal to or exceeds the sum of their respective lockdowns. In other words, during 2 months that China slowed to near zero, the U.S. slowed somewhat. Now, the Chinese economy could theoretically resume manufacturing, but China is dependent on orders coming from the U.S., which will only happen when the U.S. gets back to normal. In addition to this economic codependence, another very frightening feature is U.S. dependence on China for vital items such as pharmaceuticals and for defense critical products and components. For example, during the outbreak, it was discovered that China is the second largest supplier of pharmaceutical drugs to the United States, with 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients in U.S. drugs coming from either China or India, as well as 90% of generic drugs. And fear arose that with factories shut down in China, there would be a shortage of life-saving prescriptions in the United States. Consequently, the Council for Foreign Relations recommended the United States should consider scaling up the manufacturing capacities of U.S.-based facilities that make active pharmaceutical ingredients to compensate for shortfalls in China and India. In the long term, U.S. pharmaceutical companies should also rethink their supply chains, including diversifying the supply of active pharmaceutical ingredients to reduce dependence on Chinese and Indian manufacturers. One of the worrisome fallouts of the U.S.-China trade war is that China is now threatening to withhold drug components if the U.S. does not behave in a way that is pleasing to the Communist Party of China. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission recommended that the U.S. government needs a national strategy for supply chain management, particularly of commercial supply chain vulnerabilities in U.S. federal information and communication technology, including procurement linked to the People's Republic of China. They further suggest that the U.S. security strategy be proactive, preventing breaches before they occur rather than reacting to them afterwards. The U.S.-China Commission is particularly concerned about products related to national security, such as information and communication technology, whose supply chains are a multi-layered web of multiple producers. Every evolution of these chains needs to be examined to determine if any component is assembled by China or entities controlled by China or entities closely linked to the Chinese government economically. Further, they warn that 5G networks and Internet of Things exponentially increase avenues for software attacks. The Communist Party of China, CCP, considers information communication technology a strategic technology and offers incentives to foreign firms to manufacture and develop ICT in China, while trying to obtain key intellectual property and technology from those firms. One of Beijing's goals has been the development of indigenous technology to make China less dependent on foreign entities. This has made the business environment in China even more restrictive. Now, foreign companies must agree to major concessions, including technology transfer, in order to operate there. Through the threat of being shut out of the Chinese markets, the Chinese government has been able to extract concessions from large multinationals in exchange for market access. Beijing also uses its economic might as a tool of the state, obtaining technology through corporate acquisitions. The PRC defends these policies as being part of its national security program, but it has also engaged in targeted hacking of U.S. federal networks and the networks of U.S. government contractors. New Chinese policies require American firms in China to surrender source code, store data on servers based in China, invest in Chinese companies, and allow the Chinese government to conduct security audits. And these audits apply to all stored files and data.